Minister, I think it's fair to say that the housing sector is in crisis, but it must be acknowledged too, this is a multifaceted problem. And it hasn't occurred just in the last couple of years. It goes back to the banking crash, construction sector withdrawals and liquidations, the loss of skilled labour, and then we've had COVID, and now Ukraine and the energy crisis. We must also acknowledge too the rise in our population, more than 360,000 since the census of 2016. But that being said, Minister, we have a regulatory and a planning and a cost environment that is adding to our construction woes. In the Sunday Independent 2 weeks ago, an article outlined a site out in Balbriggan where landowners there had proposed for a scheme of 600 houses to be developed, and they've been proposing that scheme for over 8 years. The land bank is required to undergo a local area plan review by Fingal County Council before planning can be granted. And this is one of 33 local area plans yet to be considered by Fingal, and according to themselves they are completely understaffed and overtaxed with work, and these reviews take significant time. And what is really interesting is that despite Council intimating they do not have the resources for up to 2 years, in the interim, Council is considering, the article says, that this land should be liable for the new residential land tax, despite the fact that there is no possibility of it getting planning permission. So this kind of shows that there's not a lot of thought going into some of the processes and policies that we have. And beyond that, Minister, construction sector now is a big boys game. It's no longer the purview of small house builders, and that's because the costs that arise in developing a scheme are absolutely mammoth and are only to the preserve of the very, very large house building schemes. If you look at where development of housing is going at the moment, firstly, generally speaking, the developer will carry the cost of the site. And as soon as they apply for planning permission, they will be faced with an upfront payment to Irish Water of a bond. And for any kind of a reasonable scheme of houses, 150 to 200 houses, that's a minimum upfront €1 million payment, plus a further bond for Irish Water. They will also pay development and planning levies to the local authority. And then as they get into the scheme development, it would take a minimum 2 years to develop and get approval for a planning scheme before a brick is laid on that site. And once the planning scheme is there, then the developer must finance the cost of the building of the houses until they are completed and until they pass all of their engineers' certifications, etc., surveying certifications, before a mortgage can be placed on them or before anybody can buy them. And also before the financial institutions will sign off. And on top of that, the interest charges that are being levied, most developers can only access 50% of the funding from the pillar banks. The rest they have to get from private equity or wherever else they can get it. And many of them are paying 8, 9, 10% APR on these loans. In my own city of Waterford, Minister, I can tell you I can see no new entrant to the house building sector, and that is because it is not a sector that can support anyone except those with the deepest of pockets and those with access to institutional funds. And this is a major pinch point in trying to get construction activity going. Beyond that, affordability from the renter and the buyer is falling, and we know that with inflation. But I wonder, has anybody even looked in the last few weeks, I presume the banks are looking at it, as to what the effect of rising utilities are doing to the discretionary income of households? I myself got a 5 times electricity bill for my office in the last 2 months. 5-fold increase just for heating and lighting. Minister, that's not sustainable by anybody. I don't know how it can be arrived at, but we have created a monster now in terms of the delivery of new housing in the country. And I would say the idea, and I've heard it in this House many a times, that somehow local authorities can now magic up new public building. Quangos, it's fanciful, to be honest, not least because our public procurement practices would create housing inflation twice and probably 3 times of what is being delivered by the private sector at the moment, where at least they have some control of their costs. So, Minister, I think we need some new thinking, and that means we must address the critical pinch points in the construction sector. Planning regulation is a major, major problem. Development levies are a major cost, as are utility costs prior to construction. The finance costs, surely we can find a more credible way of financing house builders rather than going to the commercial mortgage markets. In addition, we need to look at the labour shortages that we have. You cannot barely get a builder's labour now is as rare as a hen's tooth around the country, let me tell you. You just cannot get them. And the costs of labour have just risen dramatically. And also, we just cannot entice new entrants into the market unless we can provide some framework where smaller builders could potentially combine to tender for housing schemes, Minister. And fundamentally, I believe our housing sector is out of control, largely because, yes, we have some factors outside of our control, but we lost control of other levers that we have within the state, not least trying to support those in the sector and trying to provide subsidies where needed to build houses. Now, I accept that some of the schemes the government is promoting is providing additional housing units, particularly social and affordable, and I see that in my own area of Waterford. And indeed, Waterford is an outstanding local authority in terms of the repair and lease scheme, which have brought a significant number of new homes into the social market sector. But the fact remains that we are in a game of catch-up. And I believe we need additional target supports for the refurbishment of vacant and derelict property. And Minister, I'm sure you're aware that a number of those schemes where properties are looked at, they will not qualify for grant aid because engineers will come out and say that the properties are not fit to be refurbished. And then we're into a different cost then, which is basically knocking and rebuilding. And all of that has not been thought through to any great degree that I can see. So we need to give consideration to the standards we are demanding also in terms of short-term letting. I'm not sure, Minister, did you spend any time in Dublin in your youth and avail of the bedsits that were ubiquitous right throughout south and north side Dublin for years? And they did very well for a lot of people because they were low rent. And I accept that we mightn't accept the standards now, but in trying to bring in minimum standards in accommodation now, we have created just unbelievable expense in terms of accommodation, and we've got to find ways to get around it. And I hear deputies also talking about modular building. And I think there was an article recently in the English press, one of the largest modular building companies in the UK, which is up and going now almost 3 years, and they've yet to make a profit out of modular building. And that tells you some of the difficulties that are in that sector. It is not a panacea that people like to promote. And I know a number of construction companies that I have spoken to, and I have asked them why they will not go to modular building. And there's two main reasons they won't go there. One, there is exceptional difficulties in terms of the layout of the site because of levels and all of that. It's far easier to build in brick, and you can basically allow for different levels on the site. You can't do that with modular. You have to find a way to make everything fit and match. And beyond that, then, the guarantees that builders are being asked to give when modular companies themselves won't guarantee buildings beyond 20 or 30 years. And that's a significant problem, Minister. So I think we need to look at maybe some deleveraging of the housing standards that we were asking for, the likes of bedsits and that, maybe emergency legislation, because in Dublin it is chronic trying to get any accommodation, even for students and certainly for single people. I would also point out to you, Minister, the regional group quite recently, as you know, proposed a number of policy changes that government has adopted, but these need to be moved on now in terms of trying to deliver additional accommodation units around the country. So, Minister, I think we do need a fundamental rethink of our planning processes, and we need a fundamental relook at the construction sector, because we've got to find a way to bring in the smaller construction, the people in construction, the smaller companies, because without that we cannot create the capacity that we need in the market to try and fix this housing problem.